Namaste, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Bharat Varta podcast. Agriculture employs about 50% of our country, and yet it produces about 15% or so of GDP. Industry, which is often positioned as an alternative to agriculture, and there's an either or debate often that happens, right? Employs about 25 to 30% of the population and produces around the same percentage point of GDP. Uh, it's often said that there's a huge scope for improvement in both of these, right? Agriculture and industry. And a major hindrance to this is that, our laws are archaic, and it's just easier to give out doles and sops than to really reform things at a more fundamental level, right? That's what's been happening so far. But in light of Prime Minister Modi's asking states to undertake more fundamental reforms, we've seen a few states step forward and pioneer some massive agriculture and labor reforms, which could have some long-standing effects on these states and the country itself. To discuss this with me today, I have Ashish Chandorkar, who hails from MP, a state that is implementing some of these reforms, and someone you've heard from before on many different topics as well. Hi, Ashish. Welcome back.
Hi, Gary. Thank you.
We also have another returning guest, Rajiv Mantri, who's an investor and a writer, and he speaks fairly frequently on economic affairs on the podcast. Hi, Rajiv. Good to have you.
Hi, Carrie. Happy to participate.
And finally, we have Vivek Khaitan, who's making his debut today. So Vivek was a business consultant in a previous life and has since been an entrepreneur in the pharma space. Hi, Vivek. Good to have you.
Hi Gary, thanks for having me.
All right, guys. So let's dive right in. Ashish, you've written extensively about how MP's agriculture growth over the last 8-10 years, especially, has been tremendous, right? Help us understand some of these new reforms that Chief Minister Shivraj Singh Chauhan has initiated, and how this kind of ties with the previous reforms as well.
Yeah. So the reforms which have been currently taken up in the last week, Gary, are the market reforms. Essentially, in Indian agriculture, each state has got a agriculture produce marketing committee or APMC kind of a structure, where the rules say that the farmers living in a given area can sell their produce only to the nearby mandi, and these mandis are governed by the APMCs. The officials of whom are generally political appointees or local strongmen who have used that as a vehicle to run their political ambitions. These middlemen have had a huge control over the whole agri marketing and agri selling network, and the rules have been quite prohibitive so far. What MP is doing is MP is removing the APMC control completely by saying that the farmers can now sell their produce anywhere in the state and actually outside the state as well. To sell outside the state, they have to use the National Agriculture Market Platform, or ENAM, which was launched in 2016 by PM Modi. There's a single trading license now across the state, so even a trader who buys something from the farmer can also sell the produce anywhere in the country through that single trading in the state through the single trading license. So now the matching of demand and supply is disconnected from the mandi as an intermediary. That is one thing. The second thing is any location, like for example a warehouse or cold storage, can now be designated as a mandi. So like these are private mandis which can take a license and then start working. Now, let's say if you have an excess produce of a crop which you will otherwise throw on. I mean, we get so many videos where farmers are throwing tomatoes or potatoes and so on. Now these farmers can go to a warehouse and either sell it to them, and then the warehouse owner can essentially do a trade later on after the demand comes back, or the farmer can pay the warehouse to store the goods still in the mandi structure and then take the goods back after paying off a fee. So I think some of these changes are fairly radical in the way farmers approach the market. Also, bulk buyers or individual buyers can now go to the farmers and buy from the farmers directly, like from the farm gate. So as the modern trade becomes more common and as organized retail becomes more common, you will find many more buyers going to the farm gates or to the doorsteps to actually source directly from the farmers. Which also means that small farmers or medium-sized farmers can also come together to form farmer FPOs, farmer produce organizations, which can collectively market a given crop to other states or to large buyers, where the individual farmer's headache of selling it to the mandi trader goes away. So I think there's a fundamental change in the way farmers
Right.
can now sell their produce, and I think that's a fairly major reform, probably the biggest reform in agriculture sector since the inception of our constitution.
Yeah. So UP has undertaken something similar as well, right? I mean, doing away with mandis and initiating cold storages and stuff like that.
Yes, Gary. So UP has done fairly similar. UP has also done another thing, which is that what UP has done is they are saying the 46 fruits and vegetables can be sold anywhere. The mandi intervention is not needed. They can go to a building society. They can go to a individual buyer and sell, set up a stall in a city, whatever is permitted in a given city, and so on. So I think that's another additional feature in the UP structure. Otherwise, fairly similar to what MP has done. So I think these are big changes for two states which are heavily agriculture dependent and which are big rural economies.
Right. So Rajiv, how does it all benefit farmers? I mean, obviously removing middlemen and all of these redundant structures in between means that farmers have sort of direct access to consumers and so on. But what is the larger significance that you see?
So, Carrie, let's look at the farmer as a business person. And imagine if any business person is forced to sell in a certain way, whether or not that method is efficient, whether or not that method is productive, but just because of government rules, you are forcing someone to sell through a certain channel and everything else is kind of made illegal. So you can imagine how that will breed all kinds of issues. And like the mistake I think we often make is that we don't see the farmer as someone who's trying to sell a product. We kind of infantilize the farmer. We kind of romanticize the farmer that, oh, he's a farmer and let's protect them and do this for them and that for them. But giving them a certain freedom of this type, that you sell where you want, you form these kind of FPOs and sell collectively if you want. Those kind of flexibilities and bringing a certain fluidity to the sale of produce from farmer onwards will bring more dynamism to the market.
Right. Because there is this sort of a stereotype of the poor farmer and so on, right? And even though there are significant percentage of the vote base as such, they continue to kind of remain underserved, or I mean, possibly because of that, I mean, they are sort of kept that way, right? So being helped through SOPs and doles rather than adding significant value in the ecosystem to really help them.
So let's free them up. Let's free them and
Exactly.
and see what happens. We've seen the old way. We've seen the APMC way. And despite that, there was farmers distress. There is the frequent narrative in the media as well about suicides among farmers. Even though if you normalize the suicide rate to the normal population's suicide rate, it may or may not be excessive. But still, that it's not that the old system was preventing something or there was prosperity among farmers because of the old system. That's not really the case.
Yeah.
So it's important to break from the past and just thinking from a businessman's hat. If you release or free up farmers to distribute in a new way through more channels, it'll probably benefit them.
Right. And food is such a fundamental product, right? I mean, so yeah. I mean, Vivek, you had something to say?
Yes, Gary. See, if you look at from the historical perspective as to how these APMC acts came into being and what were the rationale behind it, you would see India as a newly independent country. It did not really have very well functioning markets due to ravages of British colonialism. And a lot of these structures were put in place in order to enable farmers to give them market access, etc. Now, over a period of time, they have outlived their utility long back. If you see the life of a farmer, everything about their, to use Rajiv's term, business is controlled, whether it is input prices, output prices, from where they can buy their inputs, uh, uh, whether it is seeds, whether it is pesticides, whether it is fertilizers, whether it is power that they need for their pumps, whether it is water availability, everything has massive government control. And similarly, on the output side, APMCs had been exercising inordinate amount of control on farmers. And finally, we are seeing some winds of change whereby at least the output side of the farmer's business is getting freed to some extent. I also believe that this change may actually germinate a lot of new businesses, in the sense that a lot of new age businesses would be directly able to approach farmers in order to buy their produce. They'll be able to form cooperatives of farmers in order to enable them to sell at a higher price by cutting out middlemen in between. And a lot of Indian startups should actually be excited about these reforms, because it allows them a shoe-in into an industry which had been heavily regulated right from the time of independence.
Just to add one point here, echoing what Rajiv and Vivek were saying, the ultimate intent of this reform is that we will start to look at agriculture as a business. We don't have to patronize our rural populace. We don't have to think of them as someone that government needs to do something specific. I mean, of course, we should support in terms of whatever the input support is needed to keep it viable. But to develop it as a business and to have people succeed in that area like any other industry, I think this reform will be quite crucial. It then leads to the fact, then can you tax agri income and so on? I think these are questions which will get solved not immediately, but maybe over the next 10-15 years. But I think this is a step in the right direction, that it frees up agriculture from MyBab type view which the governments have, and brings it closer to a real business.
Yeah, and to my mind, right, I mean, this is something that is right on a platter for technology, right? If you look at what technology solves for or has typically solved for, right, something like information asymmetry or optimizing supply chains and so on, right? So Rajiv, I mean, can you sort of imagine that like an Amazon or a Flipkart for, farm produce as such?
No, certainly. I think, as Vivek mentioned, imagine this is a whole distribution pathway that is now open for new entrants.
Yeah, exactly.
So earlier, an entire product category was off limits. It could only be sold in a certain way, and now in a few states, that is being allowed to be sold in more ways. So naturally, there will be entities, companies which will try to play in that area, because it's a very large category, right? I mean, food and food products are a very large category. So there will be all kinds of, I think, unexpected new ideas being tried out. Probably specialist companies coming up which will enter the space. And all told, the businessman, the business person who's the farmer, they'll have more avenues to sell their wares. So it is going to be very interesting to watch how this evolves.
Right. So another key aspect, that we want to discuss is the slew of labor reforms as such that have also happened, right, in places like UP, MP again, and Gujarat and so on, right? So Ashish, you want to talk about this? Maybe summarize some of these reforms for our listeners.
Yeah, let me talk about the MP reforms, and then we can talk about UP and Gujarat separately. See, the way the approach MP has taken is basically to say that the certain acts which today govern both the central acts and the state acts, the way they govern the industrial sector, they will be fundamentally changed. So, for example, Factories Act 1948, which is a big part of our overall labor ecosystem, it will only apply to factories which are 50 people and more, or establishments which are 50 people and more. So this frees up the smaller companies, gives more flexibility to them in terms of how they organize their workspaces, their wages, the labor entry and exit criteria, and so on. This will apply to all companies, new or old, doesn't matter. So it's a fairly fundamental change in the way MP has taken up the Factories Act reform. There's also the Industrial Dispute Act. So what MP is saying is that for new companies which set up in the state, barring one section 25, which deals with the hiring and firing and the treatment of workers around unionization, barring that one area, the law will not apply for the first 3 years for the new companies which come in. I suspect that the 3-year window has been chosen because the states expect the center to do a code on labor relations by then. So then anyway, that law will become redundant as a whole. Not redundant, but like a new, easier law will come through from the center over those 3 years. So then a lot of state acts which MP had in terms of contributing for some welfare funds and making some very specific requirements as per the state laws, I think a lot of them have been done away with. The registration process is also getting getting more simpler in MP. Like they are promising a 1-day registration for any new business currently, which might take 30 days. So registration, by the way, also means that permissions around electricity and land and all of that will also become quicker. So the government is promising that they will make it all online and 1-day registration. And if it doesn't get registered, then there will be escalations against why someone has not approved it. So there'll be an escalation path available for the companies to follow in case things don't get done in 1 day. Also around inspections, very importantly, what MP is now saying is that a lot of the inspections which the labor laws mandate can be self-certified. So you can hire a third-party agency. You can pay that agency for certification or an audit, like you would do an audit firm or in any other like services industry does basically. And the third party then certifies that the safety features or the factories, etc., are all in place. The audit frequency is more flexible. Labor commissioners will not have a lot of say in terms of how this process runs. This is currently a big source of harassment for a lot of companies. Like in Factories Act, there could be some arbitrary requirements around, let's say, having a spittoon or having a clothesline or having, like some certain kind of ventilation, etc., like which could be very archaic in their own formulation, how India used to be around when the law was created in 1948. So I think a lot of that will go away. The other part is that the changes which MP is making. I mean, of course, all changes, all state laws have to be approved by the central government and then by the President of India. But MP has made fundamental changes to the laws. As such, it applies to all new and old companies. So it is not just for new entrants. It's basically just cleaning up the entire slate and making it much simpler for the smaller companies. So less than 50 people companies in MP can really thrive now because their compliance burden is going to reduce like big time, both in terms of the actual filings and also in terms of the inspections or the questions which they are being asked. The large companies will still have to follow the Factories Act, 50 people or more. But then, of course, as we know, a lot of only about, I would say a fraction of companies would fall under that bucket, maybe 15-20%. Not sure about the MP's number. But very few companies will actually fall in that bucket to start off. And even there, for example, today they might have to maintain some 60 registers and 14 annual filings or declarations. So that would be all reduced to like one annual filing and one single registered on all topics which need to be covered. So I think it's much more, it's a big simplification which MP government has brought in. And of course, the aim here is that companies which are moving out of China or potentially trying to duplicate some capacity if they are adopting a China plus one strategy. So some of them come and set up an MP. MP already has 3 industrial zones. One is near Indore, which is called Pithampur. There's one Mandideep near Bhopal, and there's one near Gwalior. So there are 3 industrial zones already which have got okay connectivity to ports and road. Could be better, but so it's not like MP will start on a completely clean slate in terms of the availability of land and other factors. So I think the labor part is a key reform which MP has brought in.
Right. So another state that's also doing that is Uttar Pradesh, and we've covered some of the development that's happened there in a previous episode. I'm sure we'll link that on our social media soon, right? So UP has exempted, I think, all but 4 labor laws for the following 3 years. So Vivek, as an entrepreneur, what is your perspective on this? I'm sure that you have been through the entire the filing or inspection and all of that, and you know how much of a nightmare that can be, right? So as an entrepreneur, what is your perspective on this?
Yes, Gary. Before I actually give you an overview of what my journey has been as an entrepreneur dealing with labor laws in India, let me try and summarize the historical perspective as to how these labor laws are constructed the way that we see it today. I mean, I'll go back again about 100 years back. So one of the starting interventions that Mahatma Gandhi did in India was the strike in Ahmedabad Sarabhai Mills, and from then on, it has been an agitationist mindset which sort of took root in India and continued post-independence as well, which led to drafting of, and obviously the influence of the left parties in India in the initial days of independent India, which led to drafting of a lot of toxic laws which prevented India's rise for a long time. Even the reforms which came in over the period of last 30 years barely touched many aspects of the labor law reform that was required in India. As a counterpoint, if you see, there are industries where some of the labor laws are not applicable, and those industries, for example, IT, has risen very fast, but the traditional manufacturing and services sector has not risen as fast in India, simply because a lot of these toxic labor laws are still in place. Now, conceptually, I mean, these changes are coming now with the hope that this is going to lead to a renaissance in Indian manufacturing, especially, right? Now, one has to ask the question conceptually, if abeyance or suspension for some period of these laws are going to lead to that, why has it not been permanent for a long time? If for any law like labor law to be applicable, you need to have people on whom you can apply, right? Which means that businesses have to exist, they have to flourish. Now, for a business to flourish, you need entrepreneurs, you need investors, you need the management to be there, you need the workers to be there, right? If you tilt the balance in favor of just one entity at the expense of others, then obviously businesses don't flourish, which is what we have seen in India. So it's a very welcome change which is coming, even if it is for a short period, even if it is through an ordinance which may or may not pass the muster of courts, and that's something that we will have to sort of see as to how that story develops, whether these are actually implemented on the ground or actually remains on the paper only. But these are exciting times, even if it is forced due to worldwide pandemic to enable Indian businesses to be back on track. As far as UP is concerned, I'll come to some of the specific changes which have been brought in. A lot of changes which Ashish talked about, which has been brought in MP. The changes in UP are along similar lines. Apart from some of the laws around bonded labor, safety and regulations, and payment of timely wages and minimum wages, etc., all the other laws have been put in abeyance for a period of 3 years, which is applicable to both existing as well as new industries. Now, if you see this in UP, especially this Noida, Greater Noida belt is one of the most exciting emerging manufacturing destinations within India. And these labor laws are going to support the efforts of the government to bring in the migrating supply chains supply chains which are migrating out of China into India. So from that perspective, these are welcome changes. What it actually is going to achieve on the ground in terms of implementation remains to be seen.
Right. Yeah, and even the Gujarat government as well, right, which has been usually friendly to industry as well, announced that, except for about 3 basic acts, for about 1,200 days, there won't be any other labor laws that will be applicable, right? And I think one of the things that Vijay Rupani, who's the CM of the state, also said was that at present a large number of these industries, from US, Europe, elsewhere, are willing to shift their production to China, from China to other countries, right? So in that sense, this whole, post-COVID state that we're living in, right, has acted as a forcing function for that. Rajiv, you want to delve on the nuances of this, on how we can possibly attract investment away from China?
Sure. So clearly, this is on the minds of many companies to add one or more other options in addition to China for their production bases. And one thing that has been holding India back, as Vivek mentioned, for many, many years now, many decades now actually, are the labor laws. And in fact, if you look at the structure of the manufacturing sector in India, you'll find that the landscape is dotted by kind of tiny, very small enterprises, and these are very subscale. These are not able to compete. So just as much as we want to attract the companies that are looking at diversifying from China, I think even for India to build up its own manufacturing base, like an export base to create jobs and so on and so forth, it was actually extremely necessary to relax some of these labor laws, which were frankly preventing employment, not protecting employees. So when there is no employment, whom are you going to protect? And obviously with the rising population, people are not able to get jobs, and agriculture becomes like a sinkhole for anyone who's trying to make a living. The heartening thing about the changes to the labor laws are it gives Indian manufacturing a chance to sort of grow, because some certain types of labor-intensive manufacturing simply cannot scale up with the existence of these laws. And in addition to that, we should be able to attract some of the industries that are looking to diversify from China. And both these things put together will probably create many jobs in India potentially.
Right. So there is also this critique that by suspending all these laws, for a certain period of time, even though some of these might be archaic, and there might be redundant structures as such, it's akin to kind of throwing the baby out with the bathwater, right? So Ashish, what do you have to say to that kind of criticism?
So, Kerry, let's examine the differences between what MP, UP, and Gujarat have done, right? So, I think MP's ordinance or the proposed changes to the laws seem like a conventional legislative process, which will go to the, of course, the assembly will ratify it, but then it will also go to the central government and to the president of India. In UP's case, there are two questions to look at. One is that, is it only applicable for new companies or also old companies? I think the prevalent view when the first announcement happened was that this is only for the new companies. Now, if you see some of the commentary which has come out since then, and I'll point to two of them, which is one is by Gautam Chikkarmane and Rishi Agarwal on ORF yesterday, and the second one by Somesh Jha in Business Standard. I think they are now saying that this applies to the old to all the companies. So basically, we're saying that there will be no labor laws at all for the next 3 years in UP. This is one area of confusion. The way ordinance is being interpreted is there are going to be no labor laws at all. Now the question is this drafted in a bit of a hurry? Because then what happens to stuff like PF, ESIC? What about retirement funds? Will they dissolve? Will it be with the government? Can I get it back? Stuff like that. Laws around basic safety in factories and laws around maternity. I think some of those questions are like, is child labor now allowed? Because since it's no longer applicable, so is that now the government is saying, is it allowed? So I think those questions are being asked. So my sense is that the ordinance of UP will potentially go through some changes. It will need some fine tuning around what exactly do they intend to do. The Gujarat one I have not seen the draft of or any report on. So I'm not very sure about the Gujarat situation, if there's any confusion there. But as it appears, the MP one seems to be the most grounded one, and it should certainly pass the legal scrutiny without much of a difficulty. To the extent that, now let's assume that they're all, let's say UP has waived off this completely, right, for all industries. Is that a good thing? I would say that certain basic things need to be clarified, especially around these three aspects around how to protecting women and child workers, the retirals part of it, because in India, that's a big part of formalization of employment. I mean, you cannot take away your retirement money. And of course, I'm sure the government doesn't intend to take away the retirement fund. It's just that the ordinance is drafted that way. And the third thing is on the safety and welfare aspect. I think these three areas will probably have to be, I should say, backtracked or clarified in the ordinance before it goes to Delhi. Otherwise, even the central government may not approve it as is potentially. The rest of it now, coming to the more theoretical or the more philosophical aspect of, should we do this at all? Now, the thing is, let's consider a few data points. Firstly, I mean, India, about 15% of the GDP's industry, right? So the labor laws clearly haven't helped India scale things up. Conversely, where labor laws were more flexibly interpreted, like in the services industry or in, say, the pharma world, India has actually made a mark, right? So these are the two sectors where India does have global companies or a global footprint at least. So there's an argument here that assuming all things staying equal, a more relaxed interpretation of labor laws does help in India. That is one. The second part is that the labor laws today apply only to the organized workforce, which is by various estimates between 6 and 10%. So let's say if it's 10%, then 90% of the people are anyway not in the purview of labor laws. So whatever you are critiquing the changes for, the fact is it doesn't apply to 90% of Indians even today. So a lot of times what happens is in India, again, as to use the term which Rajiv used, it's like infantilizing the poorer section or the weaker section, right? So I mean, here people who are themselves very cozy and very relaxed about the things, or who are knowledgeable about the laws, are now trying to keep people out of the net by making laws so difficult that no one follows them. So I think those are the philosophical counterpoints. I would say that I mean there's an evidence of laxer laws leading to growth and the world leading growth, not just growth. And secondly, the fact is that actually, if the laws are made less restrictive, then there could actually be more formalization, which will benefit more workers. Because today, anyway, 90% are out of the net. So I think that's the counterpoint from my side.
No, and I'll also add one more thing to that, Carrie. So we do have some evidence of what happens in a state when labor laws are relaxed. So in the 2018-2019 economic survey, so there was the data about Rajasthan. Obviously, Rajasthan had liberalized labor laws under Vasundhara Raje Scindia back in 2015, I think, if I remember correctly. And in 2019, the economic survey had done an analysis of how that affected the MSME manufacturing sector in Rajasthan. And they found that the firm sizes actually increased in terms of the number of workers they're employing. So relaxing labor laws actually helped firms grow bigger, and it created new jobs. So we do have a data point in that sense. And even on the comparison with China, I think conventionally people tend to view China as some sort of a monolith, but the reality is that China, in fact, is a very, very decentralized country, and different regions, different provinces kind of compete heavily with each other to attract investment, to bring manufacturing firms and so on. And we should also remember that it's just a few provinces of China which have kind of powered their dynamic and pretty incredible rise in the last 25 years. It's mainly the coastal sort of region. Right. So in the same way, the way India has gone, and now there are 3-4 states who are relaxing labor laws. It could also be a kind of a sufficient condition for things to start moving, because it will essentially create a prisoner's dilemma situation among the states, where if you want investment, you also better compete.
Right. And how many of these labor laws actually benefit the workers? I mean, Vivek, I mean, do you want to talk about this? I mean, aside from the women and child protection laws, obviously, right? How many of these laws actually help them progress as such?
Yes. You see, so one of the things which these labor laws do in India especially is that it divides workforce into organized workforce and unorganized workforce. And organized workforce is very, very small. And the impression that it ought to be created is that these labor laws at least somehow benefit the organized workforce who are covered by these labor laws, right? Now, you see, the construction of these laws in itself is very, very antagonistic between workers and let's say, investors, owners of who have set up these businesses, which is not true. Anybody who has worked in business understands that the conflicting relationship does not exist for any successful business, right? It's very, very small. Uh, s- but the whole construction of law is around antagonism between these two sets of people. That's one.
That's a
You
great
see,
point.
some of the details now. The heuristically, when you say let's take an example of minimum wage. Now, heuristically, anybody who has not studied the subject feels that this is something whereby a floor wage is mandated for workers, so that they don't get paid anything less than that, and there is some protection around that. But when you look at the actual laws, I mean, let's take an example of just one state in India, which is, let's say, Karnataka, which has perhaps got the most detailed minimum wage laws in India. Uh, just to give you, one or two examples, it defines something like 100 plus industries. It defines different zones within the state. It defines different skill levels. And if you add up all of that, the number of minimum wages defined in one state in India will be 1,000 plus.
Wow.
Whereas, if you see, the actual minimum wage in Karnataka varies between 8,000 and 11,000 rupees. Now, within that 3,000 rupees difference, they have been able to construct 1,000 minimum wages. Now, just imagine who benefits from that. There are only two sets of people who benefit from this scene, which is the labor
Bureaucrats.
law consultants and the inspectors. That's all.
Correct.
Absolutely mind-boggling as to how this kind of situation has been allowed to exist. Now, how these industry classifications have done, now, very, very interesting. Agriculture has got some, multiple classifications. Uh, so, BD manufacturing is a different industry under minimum wage law. Tobacco processing is a different industry under minimum wage law. Now, a driver driving a lorry draws a different minimum wage compared to a driver driving a jeep or a car. I mean, it's absolutely insane to imagine what kind of minimum wage laws exist in India. And it is, howsoever educated and smart you may be, you will simply not be able to figure out for your own industry, wherever you are working, as to what is the minimum wage which is applicable to you, unless you take the help of inspectors and consultants.
Yeah, and consultants, of course, they stand to gain irrespective, right? The more the laws, I mean, obviously it benefits them as well to help make sense of this. Rajiv, just a general question to you: when will lawmakers in India start looking at entrepreneurs or businessmen or wealth creators as a positive influence? I mean, even in even if you talk about so-called right-wing governments, right? I mean, they're not essentially economically right. Many would argue, right? So, what will it take for governments to start looking at these set of people as well favorably?
Well, I think we have seen a little bit of that in the last few years, Carrie. So if you see the Prime Minister's recent speeches, I think Independence Day speech last year, he had explicitly said this. Then earlier this year, the Economic Survey had some excellent sort of uh, writing and analysis on the importance of wealth creation, how it sort of increases incomes in a country, and so on. So we have seen a little bit of that, but the sad reality is, for so many decades, there has been a demonization of business and of anyone, as they say, punjipati, as if it's a terrible thing. So it will take some time to shake off. And frankly, to be brutally honest, much of the business community in the country over the last 5-7 decades, they are also not all sort of fully clean, right? So the number of scams that we have seen, the number of kind of loan defaults and siphoning of money and those kind of episodes that have come even the last decade alone, all this sort of gives to the common person an impression that all businessmen are crooks. So there is a deep distrust, and bridging this kind of a distrust is going to be I think long drawn process.
Yeah, I mean,
Carry on,
go ahead, Ashish.
no, carry on just on the labor codes themselves, right? See, I think we should also appreciate that there's been a attempt to consolidate all these 50 or I think is it 46 or is it 76 or central laws into 4 different codes. The code on wages, which has already been passed. So, and despite this code, as Vivek said, there could be like hundreds of minimum wages in a given state, because states law override some of this as well. There are 3 other codes: code on social security, code on industrial relations, and the code on occupational safety, health and working conditions. So these are actually already been introduced in Lok Sabha, and I think they are at various stages of approvals. So I think one way to look at this is that the states are looking at a 3-year horizon, because they expect that these codes to become laws in 3 years time, so that basically then a central umbrella is there to reintroduce the protection in various ways. So I think some of the criticism also has to be taken into that light, that there's a transitory period which the states are trying to create, where things are lax, and then in 3 years things may have some basic minimum oversight like you would have in other countries. To Rajiv's point, I think the biggest element, however, that remains to be solved by the governments is the whole question of trust. I think the companies are generally seen as someone who's doing something hanky panky. They are never assumed to be doing something right, and the amount of management it needs on the political side in any state across any government, the lot of connections which are needed to get simple things done. I think that is what eventually we have to get rid of to make things work in India.
No, and even if we just see in the last decade, some weeks ago, I found like an old copy of the Business Standard billionaire list from 2007, and if you go through that list, and the number of people who have fallen or been exposed as being involved in some kind of scam or the other, it is just shocking. These were some of the most iconic sort of business houses and industrialists, and one after the other in the course of a decade, they have found themselves entangled in all kinds of odious situations. So there is a good reason why in a country like ours, there is a suspicion, and I think leaders, the business community itself, sort of a lot of people have to work to bridge this trust gap.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. No doubt about that. Vivek, we want to end on a positive note. So why don't you suggest some ideas for business growth along the lines that, what we have discussed thus far?
Yes. So as Ashish and Rajiv both said, the trust deficit is perhaps the biggest impediment that businesses in India face, because they are believed to be doing some hanky-panky all the time, right? So I think as an overall approach, one of the things that political leadership in India can do is to simply fight this mindset and actually place the distrust on the Inspector Raj rather than the businesses. So one of the ways in which that could be done perhaps would be to simply hack away on all the inspections which are which a business is supposed to undergo. I mean, a manufacturing business in India may have to undergo something like 40 to 50 inspections a year if all the inspections actually fall in the same year, right? So one of the things that regulations need to do is to simply waive them off, which we have seen getting started with labor laws in India. Hopefully, this will lead to concretizing of some of these gains which are being made. The labor law suspension or abeyance, as it has been brought about, will be something that will get concretized into common sense in India, and not just remain something which happens only in 2 or 3 states, but actually happens across India.
Yeah, that's a great note to end on. As optimistic as ever, I suppose. So thanks so much for joining us on this podcast, guys. It was really, really fascinating to listen to you guys. So thank you everyone also for tuning in to listen to this episode of the Bharat Varta podcast. We're now available on a bunch of different platforms, Anchor.fm, Apple, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Pocket Casts, and others. If you like this episode, please subscribe and share this as well with your family and friends. We're also on YouTube, I'm informed. So there you go. That's another channel for you to check us out on. So until next time, please stay safe. Take care of yourselves. Jai Hind.